for coming. We are at the public meeting, Climate in Crisis, What Kind of Rebellion Do We Need? And I just thought I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting tonight on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. This land was stolen, it was never ceded, and we recognise the elders past, present and future, and that this land was always and always will be Aboriginal land. So our first speaker for tonight is Violet. Violet is a volunteer with Extinction Rebellion Melbourne and has a lot of experience in that area. And Violet will be talking about Extinction Rebellion, among other things. Our next speaker is Jacob. Jacob is a Socialist Alliance member and he's also an Extinction Rebellion Moreland volunteer. So he's also involved in Extinction Rebellion.
So I would also like to start by acknowledging that we are on stolen land. This is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and sovereignty was never ceded. There is two really important campaigns going on at the moment that you can get involved in: the Djapurong Sacred Birthing Trees and also SEED, the Youth Indigenous, are fighting Origin for the Northern Territory fracking. So please get involved with those two movements. It's all very well to acknowledge country, but it's actually really important to actively support our First Nations. So with that, I want to talk, first of all, prep you about the bystander effect and why we see that people are moving on with business as usual at the moment. So they did this study where they sat someone in a room by himself filling out a form. They put smoke through the vents, and this person, when they see the smoke coming through the vents, they go, "Oh, there's smoke coming through the vents," and they get up and investigate. Pretty normal. However, if you put this person in a room full of actors who do not respond to the emergency situation that's going on, people will actually continue to fill out the form for up to 20 minutes. They'll actually stay there until they cannot see the form in front of them, and they have to cancel the experiment. And this is what we call the bystander effect. And so that's what's happening at the moment. We're all kind of aware that there's this really uncomfortable situation happening, but we've got our story going on in our minds that we're supposed to continue on with our job. We've got to, drive our car to get to work. We have to be obedient to civil society, but that's actually not serving us anymore, and we have to make the decision to stop being a bystander and break that effect. And the reason that we have to do that is because the scientists are saying that these are some of the most important years in human history. We are heading for an uninhabitable Earth. So I invite you all, as a first step, to change your language. Stop saying climate change. It is not climate change. It is a climate crisis or a climate and ecological emergency. Really important to grab that ecological emergency as well, because we're having a biodiversity, we're in the sixth mass extinction. You may have heard those terms before. So anything that you want to know about the science is in this book. It's all fully referenced. Don't mention the emergency. They have copies of it here. You can download a copy online, or they're $5. I've got a few here as well if you would like them. So the other thing that with the science that I just really drill in for you is that the Earth is already too hot. We are seeing ecosystems dying. We are seeing people dying. We are seeing heat waves breaking out. We're seeing bushfires getting more intense, sea levels are rising, glaciers are disappearing, we're seeing the permafrost is melting. So we're already too hot, and it's really hot in here, isn't it? It's that light. So I just want to let you know that there is no such thing as a carbon budget. There's no such thing as zero emissions by 2050 is going to be fine. We actually need to just move into emergency mode and zero out as soon as possible, plus drawdown. We have this amazing technology that does drawdown. It sucks CO2 out of the atmosphere, puts it back in the ground. They're called trees. And so we need to reforest. Yeah. So however, Extinction Rebellion don't really talk about solutions. The reason we don't do that is because that is what we've been doing on the left for a very long time. We've all been dividing and arguing over solutions to this problem, whereas what Extinction Rebellion do is we actually try and get past this solution-oriented thinking and look to how to actually set up a better system to handle the situation. Let's move on to Extinction Rebellion. So our politics is broken. Anybody dissent to that idea? No, great. So while the scientists are saying that we are in this emergency situation and that we have to take unprecedented action to save our lives, save the habitability of our planet, our government are approving coal mines, they're building more airports, they're mowing down cultural land to build extra roads. And so what we actually have here is a situation where, come on, keep going, where we need to rethink how politics is done. So Extinction Rebellion have 3 demands. The first demand is to tell the truth. So our governments must declare a climate and ecological emergency and work with institutions to announce that as publicly as possible. Basically let everybody know this is an emergency, you know. Imagine if there was a bushfire coming to your house and the fire brigade was like, oh, don't tell anyone, you might freak them out. No, that's not what you do. You sound the alarm. So we need to sound the alarm. Melbourne City Council over a month ago declared a climate and biodiversity emergency. Have you seen any alarm bells being sounded about that? No, shame. So basically, here we go. I got it working again. So the second demand, yeah, we're there. So the second demand is to zero out by emissions plus drawdown by 2025. So that's like 5 years, 6 years, 5 years. And this is this is just as fast as feasibly possible. It's really important that we're not talking about this being economically viable. It is economically viable because it's the habitability of our planet. You know what's not economically viable? Everybody dying. So I'm serious. It's that bad. We're all going to be eating cans of beans. We are heading for an uninhabitable Earth. So we need to zero out plus drawdown by 2025. And then our third demand is a citizens' assembly. So this is how it's going to happen. So we've had 20 citizens' assemblies in Australia so far already, and what they are, it works a bit like jury duty. It's actually what the Greeks originally imagined when they talked about democracy, and it was where the term roped in comes from. So they grab a random selection of population. They did that with a rope back in the day, but we use sortition. So it's random and therefore representative selection of the population who come together, get advice by experts with funding disclosed on this situations. These happen at all levels of state, and basically they come up with fair and reasonable responses to to whatever issue that they're tackling at that point. So might sound a little familiar to a couple of other things and structures around, but this is just, encompassing the whole population coming together and making those solutions. So the way that we want to achieve that is through mass, peaceful, non-violent, civil disobedience. And this is the only way that we can actually achieve this because we've tried lobbying. I'm sure that many people in this room have spent a lot of their lives trying to get through to their government and by writing letters and filling out forms and filling out petitions. They don't work, okay? The system is not going to be like, whoop, you're right, we're corrupt. Here, you have the power. No. One-day marches are great for solidarity, ineffective in policy change. So the largest one-day march in Australia was against going to the Iraq War. It mustered over 500,000 people in Australia alone, but everyone went back to work the next day and the government was like, okay, cool. Let's keep going to war. So I think that what we're talking about here is sustained disruption. It works a lot like a union strike. So we have to hold them by the capital. And so that is happening, and that's happening October 7, so really soon. We're having at least a week-long disruption, so it's called the Spring Rebellion. Basically what we're doing is we're going to be holding down intersections throughout this very city and cities all around Australia and cities all around the world. So it's international. and it's going to cause this feedback loop of social awareness to get people talking about the climate emergency. It's not all going to get good media, but this is what happened with the suffragettes, this is what happened with the civil rights movements, this is what happens with union movements. People go, oh, well, I don't agree with their methods, but we really should do something about that climate change. And that's what we're expecting, and that's what we see historically. Extinction Rebellion is the intersection of social science and climate science. It's built off looking at big movements throughout history and trying to figure out how to mobilize people. What we figure out is that we need everybody. We need a movement of movements. We need the old, we need the young, we need, a diverse range, and to do that, it has to be nonviolent. And that's nonviolent in both verbal and physical. So we're going to make a pretty party. So it's going to be, lots of singing and dancing and playing and music and colour. Extinction Rebellion is incredibly creative, and it's also regenerative. That's the other really important thing. So when we talk about activism, a lot of people get really into activism and then they sort of only survive a couple of months. So what we need is a regenerative culture, and we're really heavy on that, making sure that we actually take care of each other. We're here to listen to each other. We have great support networks. How much time do I have left?
Oh, you've got over 5 minutes.
Yay, that's great. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the principles of nonviolent direct action. So first of all, they have to be respectful. This means to each other, to the police. On that, I know that there's been a lot of discussion lately about what it means to be respectful to the police and what that means to the people who've been repressed by the police. And if you look at movements like the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King himself wrote this really beautiful quote that's like, you can take us out of our homes in the middle of the night, but we will still love you, and those sort of things. And I think that it's really important because when you act with violence to an oppressor, that gives them more of an excuse to use oppression. And if we act with violence to an oppressor who a bystander believes is doing in the right, then they see us being repressed and they say, good, you should be repressing that violent person. Whereas if we're being completely non-violent, open-hearted and respectful, and we're being repressed, then that means that the bystander goes, hey, what about our freedom of speech? Why would you do that to that person? I'm going to join them. And so it's really important that we're respectful. It's really important that we're disruptive. So I already sort of covered, like a union strike, you have to hold them by the capital day after day. And also disruption, it forces people to talk about it, If it's just sort of a sign on the side of the road, people can just ignore it. But if they're late for work because you're in the road, then they have to go, oh yeah, but it was because of the climate emergency. They say climate emergency, that starts creating wires, that starts creating acknowledgement that there is a problem going on. Sacrificial, so that's the next element. So not only are we disrupting you, but we're willing to take the consequences of that disruption. We're willing to get arrested. We're willing to go to jail. We're willing to accept monetary fines because it is that serious and that big of a problem that I am willing to give up my life to show you and to save, hopefully, my family, because I've got a little nephew and I just can't bear the thought of him not being able to eat. And ideally backfiring. So a backfiring response is something that happened on the bridges of Paris. So in Paris, they sat down, a bunch of peaceful protesters for Extinction Rebellion, sat down on the bridge. Within 20 minutes, the police came in and pepper sprayed them all. And the video of that got over about, I think, 1 million likes on Greta's page. No, 4 million. 4 million on Greta's page, and almost 1 million on Maria Cotillard, who's like a French actress. And so basically it's like, when, like I said before, if they repress us when we're being peaceful, that causes a backfiring response because it doesn't matter what they do, they're kind of caught in it. Either they let us keep disrupting, and then, you know, the businesses are like, no, get them off the road, or they repress us, and then we get positive media for that, which is what we saw on the Princess Bridge action the other week. Was, you know, the media got really upset because the police kettled us. They basically stopped anybody from being able to get on the bridge, and they stopped the media from being able to get on the bridge, and the media was like, that's infringing on our rights. We're going to write stories that support Extinction Rebellion. And even right-wing media were writing posts, articles, and then attaching videos of how to join XR on their feed. It was ridiculous. We were like, our media team were like, so that's the general principles of nonviolent direct action. So we do training, NVDA training, nonviolent direct action training. Through that, you learn how to not just keep yourself safe and have informed consent. That's really important, informed consent on any action that you're being a part of. But it also teaches you all the other actions, because it's not all about being arrested. For every one arrestable person, we actually need at least 20 not arrestables to provide support. So if you're an arrestable, you're called a bunny, or if you're up high, you're called a possum. And each bunny has a bunny buddy, so somebody who is like specifically designed to take care of your well-being. And so they're just like sitting on the sidelines out of the arrestable zone and just like keeping an eye, and if you need something, they'll be like, hey, police liaison, another non-arrestable role. Hopefully, actually, our police liaison got arrested on the Princess Bridge, and that was like well out of way. Anyway, so then we need media liaisons. We've got regenerative culture teams, people who don't even have to come to actions, who just like help us paint signs, doing talks like this. There's so many different ways to get involved to help strengthen the rebellion, but it is absolutely the most vital thing you can do to save our planet at the moment, because capitalists are not going to give it up, and unfortunately we just have to take it back. We have to take back the control of this planet into a fair and democratic society that actually understands and is telling the truth about what the toll is of this overconsumptive lifestyle on our planet, and that's it straight. So I think maybe that kind of covers it, other than I guess generally, after like an hour of people listening to me tell you how important this is, I get people to ask, put their hand up, non-binding, but put their hand up if they were in a situation or came to an action, if they'd be willing to be arrested. So maybe I'll just throw that out to you and see what you say about that. So if you put your hand up if you're willing to be arrested. Yeah, beautiful. Awesome. Thank you so much. And everybody else, like I said, there's so many ways to be involved. And please come to October 7. We're meeting at Carlton Gardens at 10 a.m. We'll be having an assembly straight off the bat to decide what kind of actions that we will do. But we're going to do, we know obviously we have a bunch already planned. On Saturday, I'm organising the nudie march. Yeah, we'll paint our bodies and undies on, but that's it. So that's my story.
So our next speaker is Jacob. Jacob is a Socialist Alliance member and also an Extinction Rebellion Moreland volunteer. So go ahead, Jacob.
All right. So I guess for this talk, I sort of want to have a bit of a kind of, I guess with the idea kind of with this public forum was to have someone, you know, like Violet from Extinction Rebellion, given the sort of Extinction Rebellion kind of perspective on, you know, what is the sort of type of rebellion we kind of need to save the Earth from extinction. And for me, I'm going to be giving sort of the more socialist, sort of anti-capitalist kind of perspective on what is kind of needed to stop, you know, the world from going to its inevitable kind of decision. And I guess the main kind of point is it's not really an understatement to say we're really living in a dystopian age. It might not feel like it, but I think we are. Because governments from around the world since the 1990s have known about the devastating impacts of human-induced climate change. But for the most part, they've either disputed the findings, accepted them, but then they did really little about it. And of course, there's already overwhelming evidence, as sort of Violet has alluded to, that the world has already passed certain tipping points, setting off, large and unpredictable changes in the climate. Yet, why is it that we're in this sort of stage that governments are refusing to act on the scale and pace that is required? In fact, you can say that the worst thing that governments are doing is they're not actually doing nothing, they're actually just making the problem worse. Our very own government, for example, is pushing to build coal mines, for example, the Adani coal mine, cynically disrespecting the wishes of traditional owners, evident in how the push to the build Adani has been met with fierce opposition from traditional owners. And of course, to quote Extinction Rebellion, we are facing an unprecedented global emergency. Life on Earth is in crisis. Scientists agree we have entered a period of abrupt climate breakdown and we are in the midst of a mass extinction of our own making. And then while the world is getting hotter, extreme weather events, etc., all that, there's also other problems. For example, the gap between the rich and the poor is growing, and then there's a whole level of inequality, racism, sexism, etc. And yet, at the same time, while this climate crisis is happening, what has been truly inspiring has been the active resistance from all corners of the globe that have often been led by the communities who have most to lose from this crisis. Many probably remember, and some people were even radicalised by this, the whole struggle against the Dakota pipeline that was led by Native Americans in 2016. And of course that could have laid the foundation for all sorts of other political struggles that happened from there. But I think, the most recent example that probably everyone here can remember of active kind of resistance has been the expiring example of the global climate strike that happened this Friday. Led by school students, 350 co-founder Bill Mckibben estimates that on that day, about 4 million people took part in roughly 2,500 climate strikes in more than 163 countries on 7 continents. This is kind of like, I would consider this a phenomenal success for a movement that really only just emerged last year. When we look at Australia, there were the calculations show that there were over 150,000 people in Melbourne alone, another 100,000 in Sydney, and of course there were many thousands who mobilised in other rural parts of Australia that generally don't have generally not seen such mobilisations before. And I think one of the things that's kind of important to point out is where was Donald Trump and Scott Morrison while this global climate strike was happening? They were having dinner with Gina Reinhardt, which I think that's a kind of example that says everything about how politicians what they actually think about the aspiring school students and the people who are actually demanding action on the climate. I can't think of a better kind of example. Yet I think one of the sort of things I want to sort of have a bit of a discussion about is, I think it's kind of important to kind of, as activists, to kind of critically kind of assess what is the state of the movement today in terms of taking up the fight that is needed to avert this climate catastrophe. And I think the main kind of point I sort of want to point out is I think we have to understand the power that, while that global climate strike hasn't necessarily changed politics overnight, I think that, history shows that the main way to challenge political power is through the force of large numbers of people organised in a sustained way through mass mobilisation. And I think in terms of kind of the state of the movement today, I think, where I think these past 2 years, I think, have actually been kind of the more significant, have seen some of the most significant developments in terms of the climate movement. Starting off with the high school led protests at the end of 2018 from the rise of activist groups like Extinction Rebellion. And I think you have to look at what climate activism was actually like before this. I'm not saying there wasn't any climate activism before these movements, but I think they've really sort of galvanised ordinary people in ways that haven't been seen before. Because previously, climate activism was really dominated by this whole sort of notion of NGOism, where the basic point of engagement with the climate movement was to attend small actions, which were for the most part stage managed, that focused, where really the political focus was really not on, there wasn't really any disruptive element to this, it was all really focused, orientated around lobbying politicians. Or there were sometimes occasionally acts of civil disobedience, but they were mostly kind of small actions that involved still organised in secret. In fact, in my memory, as someone who has been involved since 2013, between 2013 and 2018, I could only name 1 or 2 mass mobilisations that happened for the climate, whereas today we're seeing big mobilisations consistently. In fact, over the course of the next 3 months, we had the global climate strike. Now we're going to be having the Extinction Rebellion Week Rebellion, and then we're going to be also probably seeing the blockade IMARC protests, which will hopefully be a good size as well. And I think, as I said before, I think the rise of groups like Extinction Rebellion and School Strike for Climate has shaken up the movement in a bigger way. And I think the lack of mass mobilisations for the climate movement, while it's not like the thing that leads necessarily to a winning movement, I think it is an important ingredient for any movement, because it means that for a long time, the climate movement has lacked a mass participatory kind of character. If the politics in the campaign is driven by a small group of paid up NGO bureaucrats, that really limits the involvement from the grassroots and from ordinary people. And more broadly, the environment movement in general has really been dominated by often this sort of question of personal consumption, which in a sense, that question of personal consumption, while it can be an important one, it has often left the real polluters, which is the fossil fuel industry and the capitalists, have been left off the hook. And I think when you're looking today in Melbourne, there are about a dozen local Extinction Rebellion groups organising actions, which I think is quite a positive thing. The global climate strike on September 20 presented an opportunity for the climate movement to unite different sections of the community in Australia. It wasn't only just school students that mobilised for that rally, it was churches, it was community groups, to trade unions, who all mobilised demanding climate action. And in fact, the global climate strike had such a huge impact as a movement that even businesses that were keen to get on board, and a number of them did support the strike, despite the fact that obviously there's certain issues with that, because it's actually been the problem of capitalist businesses that have been the worst kind of offenders in terms of accelerating the crisis. And I think, we're reaching this kind of time where, new layers of activists are getting involved for the first time in the climate movement through the growth of groups like Extinction Rebellion. And, having been inspired by some of these mass mobilisations, I think we're seeing this sort of interesting kind of phenomena where we see that where ordinary people are feeling that the climate crisis is so severe that they have no choice but to become activists for life, or in Extinction Rebellion terms, rebels for life, which includes being part of the massive civil disobedience actions that disrupt business as usual. But now I think I've sort of outlined that we're in this kind of exciting period of growth for the climate movement. But what is kind of like, the sort of, what is the type of rebellion we need to avert extinction? And I think the perspective I kind of want to give today, I think, there's still, I think, limitations, I think, in sort of with both some of these new thriving movements. I think, if the climate movement is going to have to grow to the point where governments find it politically impossible to continue with business as usual, the movement will have to be democratic, inclusive, and capable of building united fronts, including with unlikely partners. And of course, the big struggles against war, racism and sexism show there's not really any sort of shortcuts to creating the system change we need. But I think, the important part is, for a particular issue like the environment, is, we have to connect the different struggles that are happening around the world. Whether in Australia, for example, there is links that can be made between the fight for the Jabberon, to save the Jabberon sacred trees, and the climate movement, because ultimately there is a question of people's control of the natural environment, but there's also the whole issues of racism and colonialism that are the heart of those things driving it. And I think, it's through building the solidarity through these different campaigns that we can stand a chance of actually building a kind of broad and kind of mass movement. But I have to skip a kind of bit ahead here, but examining outside, those kind of elements that are needed to build a kind of mass movement that can, stand the chance of actually putting the challenge of even achieving any of the demands that, say, School Strike for Climate or Extinction Rebellion is putting forward, I think there also needs to be a kind of understanding of the kind of elephant in the room, which is the nature of capitalism. Because I think under capitalism, we're living in a system that depends entirely on unfettered growth. Capitalist economies have to continue to expand. Companies must grow or die. And of course, that's the driving force of what so-called fossil fuel companies. And under capitalism, we have the whole issue of externalities. Social and environmental costs with capitalists polluting are externalised and unable to be accounted for in capitalist economies. And I think there's also the whole issue of class, where the source of capitalists' wealth that is produced under capitalism is the labour of working people like ourselves, which is appropriated because capitalists own the means of production. We produce socially and collectively, yet we have no say about what gets produced. A coal miner is simply just asked to work in the coal mine, and they have no say over why it's getting produced and what the human good of that is. And there's also the whole issue of the lack of democracy. Decisions, all these decisions that are made in society are often made by a minority and, not by the majority. And the vast majority of us generally have no say over how things are produced or in other important political questions, such as the question of climate. And I think, government inaction and climate denial are both symptoms of the same disease, capitalism, and we can't eliminate the symptoms without curing the disease. And I think in terms of kind of anti-capitalist kind of strategy today, I do find we're in a kind of moment where, the slogan, system change, not climate change, is becoming a common everyday slogan, even amongst sort of activists involved in School Strike for Climate or Extinction Rebellion, even if they're not necessarily anti-capitalist or they're not. They all are starting to see the systematic problem. I think the question is there emerging strategy that is up to this challenge that could become part of an effective anti-capitalist strategy? And I think when we look at the capitalist world today, there is a kind of toxic alliance of capitalist interests that are the clear block to any kind of adequate kind of government response to the climate emergency. And I think at the heart of any kind of strategy has to be the building of an effective counter alliance. And I think one way of kind of countering this is the whole notion of bringing the idea of climate justice and making the critical part of the movement's focus. The new youth-led climate movement has highlighted climate justice, the notion, I think, that we're not necessarily all in this together, because inequalities in wealth and class differences within countries will impact the way people cope or not with climate change. But I think, the climate movement really needs to move beyond just being one more slogan. The climate movement needs to champion real measures that will deliver jobs and decent livelihoods. That means, more than just the abstract promises of new jobs and renewable industry. It needs to be pushing for public investment in housing, energy, health and education, and reject the privatisation madness that is made thing. And I guess, a bit of a sort of slight criticism, I think, of Extinction Rebellion's sort of tactic is, I think XR kind of at its core tactic has its core tactic of mass civil disobedience, which I think is a useful kind of tactic in itself. And I think, that is something that is necessary, I think, for the future climate movement. But I think, I think the problem is it's not necessarily the power of mass civil disobedience is not in its power to shock the powerful into listening to the movement, but rather I think it's the potential to draw in the masses of people that the powerful rely on to keep businesses running. The urgency of the climate crisis is driving the search for new solutions, and there's no time to build a new system, it has been argued. And I think there's lots of kind of different solutions that are kind of being putting forward from the Green New Deal, etc. But I think, one of the limitations of the Green New Deal is that unless, workers and communities are actively involved in fight for new sustainable jobs and industries, such a plan will only amount to the greening of capitalism. And I think the way to think about it is the power lies in ordinary people, not in necessarily the state to create change. We have to be the ones to build new forms of political power. And I think, some big governments have, for an habitable planet, we have to reduce global emissions by 3% a year. Any viable solution is going to involve a major incursion on the property rights of the capitalist class. And of course, in the very words, the very urgency of this analysis rules out the market solutions within a system that has created the crisis. So I think, one of the basic kind of things, I'm kind of running time, so I'll rush through here, is the movement does need to address concrete political demands that challenge those in power. The limitations and we have to also acknowledge, the limitations of capitalism and the state of being able to politically address the demands. While there are some governments that are beginning to take the step in the right direction, it is, like for example, one example of a country is Germany. Germany is investing a lot in renewable energies. That's all well and good, but it's also still exporting its pollution elsewhere. Because, obviously they're capitalist interests that profit off the fact of exporting into zone. And I think the only way really out of this mess is through the power of ordinary people stepping into the stage of history to take the power out of the hands of the corporate elite that is currently cooking the planet. We need some anti-capitalist goal because capitalism has an unbuilt and unrelenting drive to maximise profits, because maximising capitalist profits is a more important goal for the corporate elite than sustaining a livable planet. And I think in the end, while we can go on about the problems of capitalism, a negative goal is not in itself not necessary enough. We need a positive goal to strive for, and so some form of an alternative system, which we can call socialism or eco-socialism, is the only practical alternative to the capitalist system. Socialism is the alternative to capitalism precisely because it has no inbuilt imperative to maximise profits, and the goal of a socialist society is to meet human needs. And of course, those needs include a safe climate and a livable planet. And of course, unlike capitalism, under socialism we do require democracy to function well. Even though there are capitalist countries that have the superficial appearance of democracy, the substance is always missing. And I think once the corrupting influence of private property is removed from the political process, ordinary people will discover for the first time what it means to have a substantive say on how society is managed. And of course, that is sort of in the abstract, the kind of argument I'm sort of putting forward on that is the type of rebellion we need to save the planet from extinction.
I've been to a couple of meetings like this, and the most powerful thing I heard in all of this I was sitting next to someone the other day, a young couple, and she said to me, "I'm not having children. I'm so scared." And I thought that was so an existential statement, which was powerful, but sort of a little bit like following up on what Jack said.
I was just wondering what both Jacob and Violet think about these sorts of mass movements. I know that you said you seemed a little bit sceptical about the idea of just having people in the streets demonstrating, and that you need to be rebellious and actually be actively disruptive. But if you're being disruptive to ordinary people and not to, capitalist institutions and our workplaces, and not having a serious sort of union strike type thing, not really disrupting capital, is it still just being assembling people? What is the pathway that both of you sort of envisage between mobilising people and causing enough trouble that the elite, the ruling class, has to change course?
Sure. So Ian raised a really good point that this is not something that we've been fighting newly. That this has been something that we've been trying to cause change about for decades. And I am a birth striker as well. And I cried when my sister told me she was pregnant, and that was out of grief. It's terrifying thinking about what's going to happen to the next generation, and I don't think that a one-day strike is enough. I don't think that what happened on Friday was enough. I think that it's fantastic. I think that the fact that Greta, one person, managed to mobilize so many people around the world shows that it just takes a very small amount of people to make huge differences in the world, and that's something that we have seen throughout history. But it is going to it's going to take a lot more disruption. It's going to definitely take economic disruption to businesses. So in the UK, they are targeting businesses more, but I think that in Australia, we're a year behind the UK in terms of their movement, and so we actually need to disrupt the people first so that they learn who XR are and get on board in that way and like learn our name through the media, and then we will definitely be taking it to the businesses and making sure that they feel our displeasure. Yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah, thank you.
Did you want to?
Oh yeah, I'll talk. We actually wanted to follow up with something that Violet said actually on the whole thing about disruption. In terms of like getting as a means of getting people involved. This is sort of a talk that Jeff Sparrow did after the federal election. But I think when you look at, the political response of like how the Labor Party is actually a good example, because the Labor Party was going on about how we acknowledge climate change, but we're not going to do anything about it. And, when you think about it, what kind of message does that send to ordinary people? That actually sends a message to, especially to people who probably trust the Labor Party as the representative of the working class, how illusory that is, that actually climate change isn't something that should be taken seriously, or climate change isn't something that needs an emergency response. Yet when you have thousands and hundreds of people getting involved in this sort of Extinction Rebellion kind of mass civil disobedience, I think it has kind of a reverberating effect, because the type of people who are getting involved in Extinction Rebellion are kind of normal, kind of ordinary people who have never been involved in activism before. So if someone who's in that, if someone's like friend, someone's mother, someone's daughter, etc., like if you think of it in those terms, is participating in that act of civil disobedience because they're that concerned about the climate change, that is sort of the notion that can actually inspire people to be part of the kind of a mass civil disobedience movement, especially when it's centred around the climate crisis. Now, the first thing I wanted to actually talk about is, I think Ian is right, that, in a sense that children's futures are being taken away, but I'm not really necessarily in agreement with this whole approach around, not having children, etc. I think my view is still that if people want to have children, they should be empowered to do so. And also, I think it also ignores more the kind of class issues, because I think for a lot of people who are in poorer communities, they have children as an economic means of survival. There's a reason why bigger families happen in poorer communities. It's because it's the means by which they survive. And even in the face of a climate crisis, probably a lot of people would be thinking along those terms. And I would think it's a bit of a middle class, almost privilege to say that you're not going to have children in the face of this climate crisis, where there's probably going to be a lot of people, especially in poorer communities, who are going to have children in order to actually to survive this crisis. I think that's just my kind of view. And in terms of, I guess, the significance of the global climate strike, I think, it's true that one day, one big massive protest is not going to change the world overnight. But I think, you have to look at what happens through those protests. Through those protests, there are millions, hundreds of people who are getting themselves self-organised and mobilised for the first time. They're making political connections with the people who are going to be at the protest. The fact that it's such a massive protest, you have to also think about, well, what would the people in power think if there was this lead up to this big, massive protest, and called September 20th, and only 10 people showed up? What kind of message would that kind of send to the people in power? The fact that the people in power are trying to do as much as possible to disregard, including attacking the children who led the protests, including making all these sort of right-wing kind of smears. I think it's indicative of the fact that it is, in a sense, having an impact, but it has to be sustained with continuous kind of resistance. In fact, there has to be more, there has to be another global climate strike, and it has to be even bigger than the previous one. In fact, unions will have to put in more, because, you know, the fact that unions while the union contingent was quite impressive, the fact that, you know, the construction union and the ETU, which are two of the biggest, most important industrial unions, didn't have a big mobilisation is actually a bit of a blight on them. And in fact, we should be pushing them to actually do more in terms of mobilising, because that, in a sense, would lay kind of basis of for more political change. And I think, you know, it's that level of sustained resistance that I think is going to be important. And it's going to be really important that the Spring Rebellion is going to be the biggest possible, because the more numbers we have, the bigger impact it will have. And I think you have to continuously kind of build that ongoing resistance. And I guess, as I kind of said before, you know, as a socialist, I think it's, you know, through these mass protests, people start to get a sense of their own kind of power, that, you know, they can be the ones that are capable of running society, and they don't have to depend on bureaucrats or politicians at the top to run things for them.
Thank you, Jacob.
Can I just direct a response on with the birth strike? I think it's really important to clarify that nobody who's a birth striker is like people should be birth striking. It's definitely just an acknowledgement. Like for me, I was at a point I just got engaged and I was like, okay, let's start thinking about kids, and I felt myself immobilized to do that. And then I started talking to some of my friends about that, and they felt the same way, and then we found this term. And so it's not something that we're like promoting as something that people should be doing. It's just something that we've acknowledged that's happened out of our understanding of our existential threat, and are responding with solidarity with each other. With the one-day strike, you sort of said that you know, it mobilized people and taught them to work together. But I really think that a lot of people who attended the global strike didn't mobilize in a group. They just sort of left work, did the march and went home, and they feel like they've done their bit for the climate for this year. And that's the real scary part, is that they feel like they can go home and pat themselves on the shoulder, say, yeah, I saved the planet today, when one-day marches are ineffective in policy change. As you said yourself, you know, where was our politicians while we were at the march? Have you heard any response from our government from this mass mobilization that's like, I think 2% of Melbourne hit the streets?
A week of blocking roads and bridges won't in itself do anything either. So I think it will raise awareness, will make people think about the issue, but then we've got to have solutions. Well, what can be done?
And I can't quite get my head around the fact that we've got this 10, 11, 12 years to stop this issue occurring from carbon control. Yet the real solution is eventually got to be a change in the system, which is not going to be done.
I wanted to a couple of things. Firstly, I think if you look at the the fact that climate change is happening unabated, I think one of the reasons why the politicians have been able to get away with things is because they actually, even though we're in a top-down system and all the rest of it, they know that they have to convince us, or convince enough of the population, that climate change isn't happening. And so basically the big capitalists employed climate change scientists, or climate skeptic scientists, to confuse a lot of people, because you basically, all of these movements, whether it's an anti-racism movement, movement for climate action, etc., it's actually, I think, it's really a competition between the movement and the government / capitalist class for the hearts and minds of people about, what the issue is, whether it's anti-racism or around climate issues. And I think there was a problem in the climate movement, that the movement sort of was overly focused on the science, which of course then when you had the climate scientists and the climate skeptic scientists, most people are not scientists, and then a lot of people withdrew from climate activism. And whereas I think what would have been better for the climate movement, obviously you need to talk about science, I'm not saying we don't, but you also need to expose the vested interest behind the climate skeptic scientists, because that's something which people can understand even if they're not a scientist. And then I think we shouldn't get too bogged down in this tactic's better than that tactic. I think the Extinction Rebellion, Week of Rebellion, is more likely to be successful because of the global climate student strike. Because I think the thing is, there's no one tactic. I mean, I've seen plenty of big protests that haven't necessarily resulted in immediate change. I've seen plenty of civil disobedience that hasn't resulted in immediate change either. And, you know, movements can peter out or become ongoing. And the thing is, I think the ruling class tries to pretend they're not concerned about lots of people coming out in the street. But during the anti-Vietnam War movement, when they released the Pentagon Papers, they were watching the numbers on the streets because they were worried there might be a socialist revolution. That's really why they pulled the troops out of Vietnam. And the Vietnam War movement, I mean, I was born younger, too young for that, but it had a combination of mass peaceful protests, civil disobedience, all sorts of different action, and I think you can't fetishise any one action, otherwise then the action starts to become the goal rather than the issue. And I think mass protests like on Friday, especially ones that are large enough to cause lots of regional protests, like there were 4,000 in Geelong, 1,000 in Bairnsdale, 1,000 in Ballarat, and I don't know, love to know the details of all the other regional
2,000 in Wangaratta, 200.
Yeah.
2,000 in Albury-Wodonga, 200 in Wangaratta.
Wow, so we need to collect more of these stories, because those sort of things do lead to action. Maybe not everybody, but I think each of the movements I think the student strike and XR are really part of the same movement, and we need to feed into each other. And I think one does feed into the other. And the global climate strike, I think, is particularly important because you actually have to draw the population, the massive workers into the movement. Otherwise, you're not going to have change, basically, because you can have civil disobedience, which most workers are not able to be permanently involved in that.
Time's almost up.
Because you have to live. Yeah, I'll finish here. So you do need to draw the population into the movement, and some might be part of this action or that action, but I think that's all part of it, part of us winning change. Anyway.
Excellent. So Viola, did you want to respond first?
Sure. Okay. So, just Chris first. So after, like I said, we're a year behind the UK in their Extinction Rebellion, where Extinction Rebellion was born. And so Extinction Rebellion kind of mobilised 2 dates and then have a regen and then mobilise 2 dates. So the last date they had was in April. Here in Australia, we blocked 1 road. In the UK, they held down the city for 11 days. And out of that, they actually got a citizens' assembly installed. So we are seeing this sustained resistance, actually seeing actual effects in our political system. It is advisory at the moment, but this is obviously a huge step forward to even have the idea of it being implemented. You talked a lot about just transitions and the fact that people voted for the way they did because there was a promise of jobs. However, the jobs were a lie. There are actually not a lot of jobs in the new coal mines. It's all going to be automated. So I think it's really important that we actually go back to what I originally said, which was avoid arguing over solutions. We are implementing citizens' assemblies, which are basically, people come up with fair and reasonable responses. The ones that we've held already, they held one in Darebin where they got a sum of money to open up put more infrastructure into a park, and held a citizens' assembly to get people to like decide what they were going to put in this park. And the citizens actually came together and decided to give all of the money to a disadvantaged children's centre instead, and that like wasn't part of what the options that we're giving. But when people come together and are given, you know, the chance to really decide what's right, I genuinely believe that without people being pressured by vested interest, they will make good choices. I put a note here, we are using too much energy. Oh, yeah, I think you talked about what are we going to, how are we going to get, like, transition over into renewables. I think one thing that we really have to acknowledge is that we are over-consuming. Our society today consumes so much more than any other generation, and so I think it's really important to acknowledge that part of this transition really is going to be reducing our consumption, especially when it comes to energy. You know, again, Extinction Rebellion don't talk about solutions, but obviously I have my own opinions. I'm just an individual. So there's that. Sean, you talked about, Sean, which one? Sean? Yeah, there we go, sorry. So you talked about having 12 years and like the scientists saying that, but I think, you know, I started out saying that the earth is already too hot, and I really do encourage you to sort of take that on board. People are already dying. In Bangladesh, you know, the water that is from the sea level rises is 1/3 of their agricultural land is salinated. They can't grow food on it. So we don't have 12 years. We're actually already in a really bad situation, and so we might be feeling pretty comfortable here where we're at, but parts of Australia are already being eroded away by seawater level rises. We're seeing the bushfires get more intense in Tasmania.
12 years I quoted was the irreversibility point.
Yep.
Not the fact that everything's okay now.
Yep, and I check when that paper was released, because there are tipping points that have already popped that you know may indicate that we're already past that point anyway, and so that's why it's really important that we include plus drawdown into our demands, because we have to start sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. We are already too hot. We don't have 12 years. We don't have 2 years. We should have been implementing this decades ago. We're also in the 6th mass extinction. So I had this truck driver come up to me at a protest, and he was like, I had one of the signs that said 75% of insects gone since 1992 or whatever. And he was like, I need that sign. And I was like, why? And he's like, well, because I'm a truck driver, and, you know, I used to have to pull over and wash my windscreens every 20 minutes. And now I haven't done it in months. So he drove from Sydney to Melbourne without one splat. And normally you'd have to pull over several times. So we normalise, they call it the windshield effect. We're normalising the changes that are happening in our environment, but insects pollinate our food. Our food is in threat. And so we don't have 12 years. We need to start now, because insects are smaller, they're more susceptible to the pollutants that are around. That's why they're going extinct. Yes, we do need system change, and we need radical system change as fast as possible. I hope that that's possible. All we can do is try together. I also want to really acknowledge that what happened on Friday was fantastic. I don't think that it was, you know, not enough or whatever. When we're talking about what happened with Vietnam, there was multiple things that happened. But when I talked about one-day marches not being effective enough, I talked about what happened with the Iraq War. So we had just one-day march about going to Iraq, and that was ineffective. So it's really great to see that there are lots of things happening with the climate emergency. Just reminder, climate change is banned from all of your language. You have to call it climate crisis or climate emergency. Tell the truth. That's one of the slogans of Extinction Rebellion. The other one is act as if the truth is real. What's going on with the Spring Rebellion? Well, it's about sustained pressure, but also it's about sacrifice. There are going to be thousands of arrests, and this is about people, and that's the other trigger. It's like, you know, it's not just the fact that we're willing to disrupt your day, but we're willing to sacrifice ourselves to do it, and that shows how important it is. It's not just like we're on our high horse and we're gonna, like, you know, destroy what's going on. It's like, this is so bad that I've been arrested 3 times already for the climate emergency. The first one was outside the IPA, and that was to try and expose the vested interest. You talked about vested interest and exposing those climate deniers. And so, originally I wanted to glue my butt to their window, but they wouldn't let me, so I just glued my hand instead. And the police, they didn't want to arrest us because it's extra paperwork for them, so I ended up having to escalate and spray paint climate emergency on the floor out the front of the IPA, at which point they arrested me. My second arrest, I was targeted at the uni swarm by the police as an organiser, even though I was not an organiser. And the third one was on the bridge action that happened the other weekend. It's not just civil disobedience, it's mass civil disobedience. So I wrote that. I hope that responds to something that you said. And the other thing is, like I said, we have these build dates. There's a book called This Is Not a Drill, and that covers the main points of what we're supposed to be doing here. We're actually supposed to head to our capital city. So this rebellion, because we are a year behind the UK, we've mobilised in the individual cities, but the next rebellion date, we will all be going to Canberra, because we've got it's really important that we actually apply pressure to our politicians. It's them that we're disrupting getting to their work day, because that's what makes them have to respond. You know, they're not responding to 300,000 people on the streets, or however many it was, because they can just go to dinner and ignore that it's happening. But if we're like in the way of them getting home on a Friday night, you bet they're going to want to respond to us. So the next one is in Canberra, and I invite you all to that as well. Keep an eye out for that date. It'll probably be in next year though. Yeah, maybe April.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. What I might do is just take a final round of 3. Did you want to respond to something?
I think isn't standard practice
Oh, I'm
at
so
all.
sorry. I
Yeah.
didn't realise. I'm so sorry. I forgot. Please, Jacob, respond.
Okay. Well, I guess to respond to the first thing that Chris Lee said about sort of just transitions, there was actually this quite inspiring kind of campaign around the Port Augusta that actually a number of our comrades in Adelaide were heavily involved in. I mean, the basis of that campaign was to make the argument that this coal plant in that was shutting down could actually be retooled into a solar thermal plant in Augusta, which is sort of a remote area in Adelaide. You know, that campaign won and lost at the same time, in a sense that we actually won the government to support it, but because the government it relies on a market system, they couldn't actually find a contractor for. It wasn't economically viable to actually build the solar thermal plant, which actually just goes to show the kind of inaccuracy of kind of market solutions and how we can't actually just simply just appeal to the state to do things for us. We actually have to mobilise and fight to demand to the state that takes it on, and that we are actually part of directing the political process when that happens. And I think. And your contribution, Sean, I guess, I think we're in a sort of moment where, where it does seem to be that the solution is a full-on system kind of change, but there's clearly not enough time to do it in time. But I think if you look at history, things can happen really quick, fast, and, when you look at the kind of political developments around in the UK are quite exciting in a way. The fact that there is, a leading, Jeremy Corbyn does call himself a socialist, and he is running on a pretty strong kind of social kind of democratic program. But I guess the main kind of problem is there's going to be limitations imposed on just relying on a Corbyn government to be elected. There's going to need to be a mass movement to be able to defend the government at any cost, because essentially the capitalist system is at this point where it won't even accept the mildest of reforms. It will do everything in its power to hold back any change, any progressive change. But when you look at what happened in, say, Greece when they elected a left-wing government, the European Union did everything in its power to basically crush the Greek government and basically prevent them from not implementing something as basic as austerity.
The difference in political climate between the UK and here, and
Like anti-union and the news media and the police.
yep. So we do have a media team who does try and respond to that. In terms of the police treatment, it's not the students' action that I've heard about, but actually the repression of our First Nations people. So Tanya Day's case just hit court, if you've heard of Tanya Day, and she was a First Nations person put into custody and died in custody. And so I think what's important is that we acknowledge in these situations that we're not buddies with the police. We're not trying to be nice to them because we respect the oppression that they put on us. We are respectful to them because first of all, it doesn't alienate people who don't necessarily understand the oppression dynamic that's at play. You know, your average mum or gran or whatever is not going to walk past and see us yelling at the police and think, yeah, they deserve that. So it's going to alienate people if we're not respectful. So it's just really important that we maintain that non-violence for that reason, but it definitely, it is a very difficult situation because we don't want it to seem like we're not aware of the oppression that does occur because of the police. So thank you for bringing that up. And
Just to clarify quickly, I sort of meant how to sort of avoid the risk, not so much about what the activists would do with respect to the police, but how to actually avoid the potentially more tangible risk of different types of treatment that don't happen in the UK. And how to make people, I know some people have said to me, they're a bit more aware of that, people who teach about that and research that sort of thing, social scientists.
Look, there is a huge risk in what we're doing, absolutely, and not just from the police, but from the general public. You know, when we swarmed the streets to block off the bridge, someone got out of their car and almost hit my partner. There are always going to be risks. I think that's really good to acknowledge and really important. We do training to try and teach people to de-escalate situations, but at the end of the day, if we don't do something, we know what our path is. I think I've made it pretty clear, and so there's more risk, and so actually it's kind of worth that risk and worth that sacrifice. For me, and you can make that choice for yourself, and your friends can make that choice, and your friends can make that choice, but I certainly know what side of history I want to stand on. Plia, better language on the back. Oh, in this booklet here, there is a full list of, we talked about acknowledging the language. There's a full list of language of do's and don'ts in terms of making sure that you are telling the truth on the climate emergency. And yes, you're right, capitalism absolutely sucks and should be taken down, and we should be using that language as well. There's a lot of debate in XR about talking about that. Again, I'm just an individual of XR. We don't have official spokespeople. We're a decentralized movement. I definitely think that capitalism is the problem, and I'm willing to talk about that. But officially, we've just got those 3 demands, and we need to stick to that because solutions divide, and we want to put in a place for a better system, and for that we need to use language and movements that bring everybody on board, that people aren't afraid of. You know, your average Joe, everyone here is a free thinker, but your average Joe, I think, is a little afraid of socialism and a little bit afraid of taking down capitalism and all of that stuff. So we just got to be careful in that way. But I hope that answers. And XR and Socialists do have an alliance all around the world. Like, it is very clear that we match quite closely. So it's really lovely to be invited here tonight, and thank you so much. And as you can see, there's many people here who have already sort of crossed over and realised that we are really working towards the same goal. So we are talking to the unions. So in terms of Extinction Rebellion, we've got a union team who are mobilising the unions. So hopefully that all goes through. Very happy if anybody here wants to talk to their union about XR or the climate emergency, please do. What happened in the Murray-Darling activated me as an activist. So I didn't know about Extinction Rebellion, but it was actually that I latched onto the yellow vests first because of Rick, not anything else, but referendum initiated by citizens, which is, 3% of the population sign a referendum and then we get to go for a vote. Because I was just sure that if we could get some better form of system in place, that we'd be able to save them things like the Murray-Darling from ever happening again. And when I saw all those fish floating upside down, I was devastated. I think this is a much better system. I found XR maybe a couple of months after, and the right claimed yellow vests in Melbourne, so that kind of pushed me away. No such thing as ethical consumption in our system, and the individual response is classist. So I think you were talking about, individual response in some way, or that triggered me to kind of want to talk about that with everybody, that when people talk about, a lot of people sort of point at greenies and say, oh, you've got a water bottle, or you don't have solar panels, or you're driving a car. And with Extinction Rebellion, we've got 10 core principles. One of them is no blaming and shaming. And that's really important because there is no such thing as ethical consumption in our society. And if you are trying to convince people to make ethical choices on the individual level, that's fantastic, and we should all be trying to do that. But it is classist, we can't all afford to have green energy in the system that we have. I know that I certainly can't. So that's why I fight hard for system change, because I'm a busker, I'm poor, I'm an artist, I'm a philosopher. I don't make a lot of money, but I think that I should have the right to do what's right for our planet, and that's why I do what I do. So I hope that responds to you.
Yep.
Excellent, thank you, Violet. Jacob?
Yeah, so I guess to respond to a few things, I think just to want to respond, I'll respond to Declan also a bit. I mean, I think in terms of getting people involved, I think one of the more interesting things about Extinction Rebellion, and I think this should be a character for every movement, is that everyone who is part of any kind of political movement, whether it is, Stop Adani Group or Extinction Rebellion or School Strike for Climate or, Aboriginal rights, etc., is they should see themselves as builders of those movements, and they should be doing as much as possible to try and figure out ways of drawing in people in their close circles to the movement. And I think ultimately, people respond to social movements in all sorts of different ways. I mean, one of the more common ways by which people respond is through the oppression that they actually face under the system. And for example, that's why generally that's how a lot of people get radicalised, by the fact that they're workers under the capitalist system, the fact that the capitalist system is exploitative. But then there's also the issues of sexism and racism that are other means by which people radicalise. But then there's, for other people who might be a bit more privileged, etc., who might not necessarily respond to that, people generally do have a concern about the issues. People are concerned about the future of having a living planet. And I think ultimately it's going to be hard work to convince people bit by bit that they should get involved. But I think another thing that people do respond to is viability. People are going to respond if the path you're charting forward, whether you're a political organisation or political movement, is actually making gains and pushing things forward, people will become inspired to get involved. And that was sort of a moment that happened. That there's been lots of moments when movements reach a mass size, or political parties reach a mass size, because they show the viability of their path forward, and thousands of people start to join them afterwards. But of course, it's the bit by bit work of ordinary people trying to be consistent builders of those movements and those political organisations that really gets things moving. Now, I guess, I mean, to respond to you, I guess the first question is, I mean, yes, it is true that there is some capitalists or certain intellectuals who are pointing towards the ills of neoliberal capitalism, but I would say that, I mean, I think the whole problem is the capitalist system itself. I don't think there's necessarily a distinction between neoliberal capitalism and capitalism. I think it's all capitalism, but I think, generally for socialists, our analysis of when we use the word neoliberalism, we would define it as the current kind of stage of capitalism, which is a stage of capitalism that is, incredibly, I think one of the best theorists on it has been David Harvey, who I think argues that neoliberalism is a political project for the rich. It's like an ideology for socialists like me. One of our political ideologies is socialism. For the capitalists, it's neoliberalism. It's implementing a sort of class ideology that is aimed at sort of taking power away from the organised working class, because it was responding to the fact that the working class movement was so strong, and the unions, and they needed to find a political method by which they could crush them. And it's like, it's their means by which they thing. And I think there are divisions in the capitalist class, and I think socialists or activists do have to exploit those differences, but I don't think it's never going to be the people in power who are going to lead the political change. It's always going to be the ordinary people and the most oppressed and marginalised communities who are going to be leading the fight for their own liberation. We cannot rely on the people in power to liberate us, because they're the ones who are keeping us down to begin with. And I think the other thing, I think there was another, I'm just looking at my notes. I guess the other thing is, no, I think that's, I'm trying to think. Oh yeah, I guess the differences in, I guess, the political climate kind of question. I mean, there has, one of the sort of things for Australia, and I think one of the things that I think Extinction Rebellion is currently kind of grappling with, although I heard this was official policy, but I'm not sure if it is yet in Extinction Rebellion, but there has been issues raised with the whole concept of the die-in being seen as sort of disrespectful for Indigenous people, and there might be some push in Extinction Rebellion to actually move forward from it, because I think one of the differences in the political context is between the UK and Australia is the whole question of Aboriginal and Indigenous self-determination. Unless we are willing to, any sort of social movement for political change has to make Indigenous struggle and Indigenous self-determination the centre of their political movement. Otherwise, it's not going to be a viable political movement, because ultimately, all the problems of Australian capitalism and colonialism is ultimately tied into how they treat Indigenous people. When you look at how in terms of unemployment, the way they're treating unemployed people, how that they're implementing sort of like, what are those cards called?
The basics.
The basics card. The basics card was first implemented in Indigenous communities to control their lives. If there were people that were willing to stand up and say, no, that is not acceptable, Indigenous people should be able to control, then there would be no question that they wouldn't have been able to use that means. So it's, sort of like the old kind of union slogan, touch one, touch all. We actually have to stand up for everyone and build solidarity between oppressed groups, or we have no chance of winning, because and it's the same for refugees. It's like, the way they treat refugees legitimises all this sort of problematic policy that attacks our civil liberties. In fact, they'll be using the same sort of state apparatus to attack refugees that they'll be using to attack protesters at some point. So it's sort of like, it's all the kind of issues of kind of repression and protect, and we have to find ways by which we can link up all these issues.
That was it. Excellent. So we've come to the end of our formal part of the session, and I'd really like to thank the speakers, Violet and Jacob, for their excellent efforts. Thank you very much. Great.
Thank you so much for hosting. Yeah.
Thanks.